Remember, in the beginning, when we discovered that we were going to do the graduate school, it struck me that we had never been asked to do anything this important in our lives, any of us. The death rate, 2-to-1 kill ratio out in Vietnam, which had been going on for about 5 years. It's hard, it's demanding, particularly to take something where naval aviation had been fighting a war for 5 years, and somebody says, I want to get well program. I want it in 60 days. Develop a graduate school. And as I said, you got 60 days to do it in. We really don't have much in the way of support to give you other than we'll loan you airplanes when you need them to do your evaluation. And don't lose any aircraft and don't kill anybody. But I picked, and I don't know how this happened, but it just happened that out of the 15 or so that were available that I knew well, I picked them for specific aviation flight or combat experience, for their technical knowledge and background. And I didn't have much time to do a lot of checking. It was gut feeling of how good these guys were and how willing they were to work. I chose Lieutenant Mel Holmes, call sign Rattler. He's a brilliant aerodynamicist, not degreed in it, but very good. John Nash, call sign Smash, a lot of F4 time, brilliant in tactics, and had just come from Air Force Exchange at Nellis and was a pro in air to ground. Jim Rulison, Cobra Rulison, missile performance firing envelopes. He brought more mental ability on the technical side for the radar and the fire control system and both missiles. And he handled that almost single-handedly for the first 60 days. Jerry Sawatsky, a great big Polish guy, played football for Bear Bryant, and just a superb aviator and an easygoing guy who we gave the adversary program right after the first 60 days. Jerry ran the adversary program for me. 4 pilots, you just heard them. Then we have to select NFOs, or the backseaters, as we call them. My first choice was J.C. Smith. J.C., former naval aviator, was probably the best RO or backseater I ever flew with. And he had the first MiG of the Vietnam War. He shot it down with Blue Page as his pilot. A very fine teacher. Lieutenant Steve Smith, Rebel. He probably should have been a convicted felon, and I'll tell you why in a few minutes. He's a superb RO, the kind of guy you could give a list of things at 8 in the morning to do, and by 4 o'clock in the 1600, he'd have them all done. Jimmy Lang, the famous Hawkeye, been on air, had more time on the ground in North Vietnam than any of us. He had been shot down twice, but he also got a couple of MiGs. And easygoing, quiet. He was my litmus test if we were going in the right direction. Darryl Gary, backseater, initially went on to flight training again, had 4 tours at Top Gun over the 50 years before he got out. And great tactician. I know no better pilot than Condor was. Wayne Hildebrand was the last one, and he was our spook, intelligence specialist. We got him from an F-8 squadron, and he started the archives of which exists today. Fallon has probably the best repository of tactical information in the world. Over the years, we have come to refer to each other as bros or brothers. I call the original 10, which were 9 that were with me in its beginning, as the original bros. And we still have a great reverence to that name.
Captain Gravely had gone ashore from the Jewett at one point, and when he came back to the ship, the men on the quarterdeck rang 6 bells. Ding, 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 ding.
When officers arrive, a bell is rung. And so he's listening and he's like, I'm going to talk to somebody. This is a mistake because I think I heard not the bell ring 4 times, but 6 times.
Normally for a captain, the sequence is 4 bells. Ding, 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 ding. And so his first thought was the quarterdeck watch has screwed up.
And so his XO, Commander Newcomb, is going to greet him with a really big smile and say, congratulations, Admiral Gravely.
When he got aboard, he found out that he had been selected for Rear Admiral, lower half.
He was truly shocked. The list had just come out. He wasn't aware of it. And in his usual humble style, he thought, this can't be true. I'm too junior for this. This just can't be possible.
He was absolutely thrilled because all those days and nights at sea that he had put in, had invested in doing something he enjoyed, paid off, and he became the first Black flag officer in the history of the United States Navy.
He had a career of significant firsts almost from the beginning, right? And this will be sort of the icing on the cake, if you will, or one of the layers of icing, because he'll go on to retire as a 3-star.
He had earlier been the first Black line officer captain. He had not set out to be a pioneer. It was just that the situations came along. He took advantage of them. The Navy gives officers the jobs that it thinks they will be able to do, and the performance in those jobs determines what comes next, a promotion to higher rank, a bigger ship, what have you. So that was really a great stamp of approval when he was selected for Rear Admiral.
But for an African American to reach the rank of Rear Admiral, I don't know who might have even envisioned that at that time. And the year was 1971. Think about that. There's an anti-war movement in society. The women's rights movement is more intensified. The Black rights movement is more intensified. The anti-government movement. I mean, there's a lot of things going on in the 60s. There's a reason why it's called the Radical 60s. And Admiral Gravely is selected to be the Navy's first African-American admiral.
At the conclusion of a colloquium hosted by the Naval Historical Foundation on December 7, 1999, on the 58th anniversary of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Henry G. Childs, the distinguished professor of leadership at the U.S. Naval Academy, stood before a full house at the Navy Memorial Theater and provided the summation. So the debate concerning the mix of responsibility of Admiral Kimmel and of his seniors in Washington continues. Without question, I think Admiral Kimmel did not have all of the available intelligence at his disposal that was available in Washington. At the same time, I repeat, officers serve at the pleasure of the President of the United States. Our commanders are today and must always be accountable and responsible for their actions and for their commands. Ladies and gentlemen, the price of our liberty is eternal vigilance. That's been hammered into naval officers since they first walked into the gates of whatever institution they get their preparation to be officers in the United States Navy. And I'm sure the case is the same in the other services. Our leaders in Washington and our leaders in the field must always keep that in mind. Hello, my name is Ward Carroll. If you've ever watched an episode of my YouTube channel, you know I'm eager to deal with controversial issues. And that's why it's my privilege to introduce this month's second Saturday webinar that will revisit a program that the Naval Historical Foundation hosted 22 years ago titled Pearl Harbor and the Kimmel Controversy, The Views Today. As Admiral Childs stated, our commanders are today and must always be accountable and responsible for their actions and for their commands. However, throughout naval history, we have seen naval careers ended and reputations destroyed thanks to circumstances beyond one's control. The Pueblo incident, the Beirut barracks bombing, the attack on Cole, and recent collisions at sea offer reminders of this ongoing issue of accountability. This is why the Naval Historical Foundation, then chaired by former CNO Admiral James Holloway, decided to embrace this topic. Of course, if you're looking at the calendar and saying, wait, this isn't Second Saturday, you would be correct. However, with the 80th anniversary of the day that will live in infamy coming up this Tuesday, we decided to push up the broadcast of this month's program. For this program, the Honorable Stephen S. Honigman, who served as the General Counsel for the Navy in the 1990s, will provide an overview of the investigations that determined accountability for the attack on Pearl Harbor and efforts led by the Kimmel family and allies to rehabilitate Husband E. Kimmel's reputation and to have him posthumously promoted to full admiral, the rank he held as Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. With congressional legislation pending to authorize the President to effect the promotion, the Naval Historical Foundation created this forum to enable the two sides to air their views. Following this colloquium, language was inserted in fiscal year 2001 National Defense Authorization Act that urged the President to posthumously elevate Rear Admiral Kimmel and his Army counterpart, Major General Walter Short, to Admiral and Lieutenant General respectively. Neither President Clinton nor George W. Bush would take this action. Of course, one of the two co-sponsors of the Senate legislation, Senator Joseph R. Biden, is now President of the United States. Following Mr. Honigman's presentation, Naval Historical Foundation Executive Director Rear Admiral Sonny Masso will visit with some of the participants of the colloquium and get their reflections on what transpired, and then take your questions.
Thank you, Ward Carroll, for that fine introduction. I served as the General Counsel of the Navy Department in the middle 1990s. And for that reason, when Senator Strom Thurmond, who was the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, asked Secretary of the Navy John Dalton to review the status of Admiral Kimmel and the results of Pearl Harbor, SecNav asked me to lead that effort. With the help of my staff, I presented a report to Senator Thurmond, which I'll be happy to talk about later. Right now, I'd like to set the stage for the panel discussion that will follow these remarks and give a little bit of background concerning the facts that the various investigations over the years uncovered and some of the results and some of the non-outcomes as they affected Admiral Kimmel and General Short. First, I'd like to share a few quotations that I think crystallize the issues that we're going to review. The first is a quote from Admiral Hyman G. Rickover, the father of the nuclear-powered Navy. Responsibility is a unique concept. You may share it with others, but your portion is not diminished. You may delegate it, but it is still with you. If responsibility is rightfully yours, no evasion or ignorance or passing the blame can shift the burden to someone else. Unless you can point your finger at the man who is responsible when something goes wrong, then you never have anyone really responsible. Next is a comment that Admiral Kimmel made to his intelligence chief on December 2nd, 1941, when he learned that the Navy had lost track of the Japanese carriers. You mean to say that they could be rounding Diamond Head this minute and we wouldn't know? Next is a comment attributed to Franklin D. Roosevelt after reading the 14th part of the decoded Japanese message that was supposed to be delivered at 1300 Washington time on December 7th, 0800 in Hawaii. This means war. Finally, in the words of then Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Trost, there is a vast difference between a degree of fault which does not warrant a punitive action and a level of performance which would warrant bestowal of a privilege. Now, we all know what was the result of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. 2,403 personnel dead, 1,178 wounded, 3 battleships sunk, 2 battleships sinking, cruisers, destroyers torpedoed and wrecked, aircraft destroyed. What were the roles and what were the responsibilities of Admiral Kimmel and General Short? First, Lieutenant General Walter Short, the commander of the Army Department in Hawaii. His mission, as defined by General Marshall, was to protect the fleet at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, his general duty was to take all practical steps to keep the ships of his command ready for battle, to conduct drills and exercises most conducive to maintaining the fleet in constant readiness. Those duties included responsibility for long-range reconnaissance in regards to Hawaii and, significantly, to cooperate with the Army in defense of the fleet. As we all know, both Admiral Kimmel and General Short held permanent 2-star rank, and the temporary ranks that went along with their assignments, positions in which the exercise of superior judgment was necessary. Days after the attack took place, the Secretary of the Navy, Secretary Knox, flew to Hawaii to assess the damage and decide what to do. He found that there was a lack of a state of readiness against an air attack. He talked with Admiral Kimmel and with General Short. They admitted to him that they did not expect an air attack and they had taken inadequate measures to meet one if it came. They felt that if an attack were to take place, it would come in the Far East and not against Pearl Harbor. Admiral Kimmel and also General Short were relieved of their commands. Soon afterwards, FDR appointed Supreme Court Justice Roberts to head a commission to assess accountability for the events at Pearl Harbor. The commission found a failure to consult and to confer with regard to the meaning and the intent of the warnings, and to take appropriate measures of defense required by the imminence of hostility. The commission found a lack of interest by each of them in the measures taken by the other. And it noted that the conduct of both General Short and Admiral Kimmel amounted to a dereliction of duty. This is an important point, however. Dereliction of duty was not a court-martial offense. It stung, it was a strong word, a strong concept, but it did not denote an intent to court-martial either General Short or Admiral Kimmel. Not long afterwards, both Admiral Kimmel and General Short retired. At the conclusion of the war, a joint congressional committee, as I've mentioned, reviewed the facts, took testimony from witnesses. Admiral Kimmel participated, General Short participated, and the congressional committee found a failure to institute measures designed to detect approaching hostile forces, a failure to institute a state of readiness commensurate with a realization that war was at hand, a failure to employ every facility at their command in repelling the Japanese, and it recognized the importance of failure of the Army and the Navy in Washington, to transmit critical information. However, it found that Admiral Kimmel and General Short had failed to discharge their responsibilities in light of the warnings received from Washington, other information possessed by them, the principle of command by mutual cooperation to integrate and coordinate their defenses and alert their establishments, particularly in light of warnings and intelligence available to them during the period from November 27 to December 7. That they failed to maintain effective reconnaissance within the limits of their available equipment. They failed to effect a state of readiness to meet all possible attacks, to employ their facilities, their material, and their personnel to minimize the effects of the raids, to appreciate the significance of intelligence and other information available to them. But the Joint Committee was careful to note that those were errors of judgment and not dereliction of duty. When I presented the Navy's position to Senator Thurmond on behalf of the Navy, I noted that the Joint Committee also said that the tragic assumptions made by Admiral Kimmel and General Short concerning what the other was doing are a manifestation of the fact that their cooperation was not adequate. Each was the victim of the human reluctance to pry into what was regarded as another's business. The commander-in-chief, that is Admiral Kimmel, assumed that the Army would be on a full alert. The anti-aircraft, the aircraft warning systems, and the interceptor command. Yet he did not inquire to determine whether this was the case. Admiral Kimmel's and General Short's failure to effectively coordinate their efforts into a unified defense based upon adequate tactical communication of information, clear-cut allocation of responsibility, and the shared understanding of such matters as alert levels, they were found by the Congressional Committee to have contributed to the scope of the losses at Pearl Harbor. After the committee in 1947, the Congress passed a statute that would have allowed officers serving in temporary rank to retire in the highest rank in which they had served during World War II. Admiral Kimmel and General Short were not recommended for retirement in 4-star rank. Over the years, admirals, others began to reevaluate the result of Admiral Kimmel and the result of General Short's retirement. In 1948, Fleet Admiral Ernest King had backed away from the court of inquiry testimony he gave and became a proponent of 4-star retirement. In 1954, the Chief of Naval Personnel, Admiral James Holloway, recommended advancement in rank. As the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor approached, Admiral Kimmel's family sought support for promotion. They gained support from the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association, the Naval Academy Alumni Association, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and others, but not the Department of Defense. Then they turned to the Senate. Senator Thurmond asked the Navy to conduct its review. That's where I came in. As I mentioned, I appeared before Senator Thurmond along with Deputy Secretary John Deutsch, Secretary of Defense John Deutsch, Secretary of the Navy John Dalton. I presented the Navy's position. Arrayed on behalf of the Kimmel family were former Joint Chiefs of Staff, former Chiefs of Naval Operations, retired admirals, and others, and among them, Ned Beach, the heroic submarine commander during World War II, and the author of numerous books about the Navy, including the book entitled Scapegoats, in which he argued that Admiral Kimmel and General Short had been unfairly scapegoated because, in effect, FDR, President Roosevelt, sought an opportunity to enter the war and refused the opportunity to give Admiral Kimmel a chance to prepare because he felt that the American public would be so energized against the Japanese because of their surprise attack that they would wholeheartedly support the entry into the war. Needless to say, Senator Thurman was reluctant to accept the Navy's review. The Navy, of course, had taken the position that Admiral Kimmel and General Short should remain in their two-star retirement status. He asked the Navy to reevaluate the Kimmel case with no preconceptions as expeditiously as possible. Secretary Deutsch agreed. The result of the Department of Defense review, which was conducted at an elevated level by Undersecretary for Personnel and Readiness Edwin Dorn, proceeded on the basis of a balancing of accountability and fairness. The Department of Defense reviewed 9 formal government investigations. They reviewed personnel records of Admiral Kimmel. They reviewed the full text of the Congressional Committee. They reviewed unofficial assessments, including Captain Beech's book and others. They met with the Kimmel family. They actually went to Pearl Harbor to review the Pearl Harbor establishment itself. This was the result. Deputy Secretary of Defense John White wrote to Senator Thurman, quote, "After thoroughly considering this issue, the department has concluded that official government action which would be required to advance Admiral Kimmel and General Short on the retired list is not warranted. While I regret the necessity of disappointing their families, the historical record, as discussed in the attached documents, dictates this outcome." Attached to the Deputy Secretary's letter was a very, very thorough report. The report made several points. Significantly, the first point made was that responsibility for the Pearl Harbor disaster should not fall solely on the shoulders of Admiral Kimmel and General Short. It should be broadly shared. In essence, the Department of Defense found that in Washington, there were errors, I've described some of them, in analyzing intelligence, in failing to share intelligence promptly, that could have given Admiral Kimmel and could have given General Short more advanced notice of the potential imminence of an attack at Pearl Harbor. And therefore, the blame should not fall solely upon Admiral Kimmel, that there was enough responsibility to go around. Now, I'm a lawyer, and lawyers think in terms of negligence. To my mind, this is appropriate. We have a concept known as comparative negligence, where if there's fault to be shared, each party is responsible for its portion of the shortcoming. But as the Defense Department's report emphasized, because there was responsibility on the part of Washington, that did not absolve Admiral Kimmel and did not absolve General Short of their responsibilities. In the words of the report, to say that responsibility is broadly shared is not to absolve Admiral Kimmel and General Short of accountability. The report focused upon the principle that military command is unique, that commanders are accountable for the actions and sometimes the failures within their command, and that it was appropriate for Admiral Kimmel and General Short to be relieved. For one, the intelligence that they received should have alerted them to the possibility of an attack by air against Pearl Harbor. It's been said that the resources available to Admiral Kimmel to conduct reconnaissance, long-range reconnaissance, were inadequate. But that did not absolve Admiral Kimmel of the decision to conduct short-range reconnaissance closer into the island that would have alerted General Short and his anti-aircraft ability of the incoming attack in time to have mobilized effectively and in time to have launched fighter planes to attack the Japanese planes in the air. As the Dawn report said, a different allocation of resources could have reduced the magnitude of the attack. Undersecretary Dawn also found that the official treatment of General Short and Admiral Kimmel was substantially temperate and procedurally proper. He focused upon the fact, in part, that the words dereliction of duty had been withdrawn and that later investigations, such as the Joint Committee of Congress, in his words, eschewed dereliction in favor of errors of judgment. The result, therefore, was that the recommendation back to Senator Thurman was not to advance Admiral Kimmel from 2 stars to 4. Later, in 1999, Senator Thurman, along with a young senator named Biden, and along with several other senior senators on the Armed Services Committee, included in the National Defense Authorization Act for the year 2001 a review of the various investigations and findings concerning Admiral Kimmel and General Short, and a request to the President of the United States to advance General Short and Admiral Kimmel in retirement, in posthumous retirement, to 4 stars. President Clinton did not take up that request before he left office. I'd like to turn the program now over to the Executive Director of the Naval Historical Foundation, Rear Admiral Sonny Massow, who will introduce our esteemed panel. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and thank you, Ward Carroll, for creating the context of this discussion on the revisitation of accountability of Admiral Husband E. Kimmel and Lieutenant General Walter Campbell Short from their service and leadership of our forces in Pearl Harbor 80 years ago. Many thanks to the Honorable Stephen Honigman, our Foundation board member and former General Counsel of the United States Navy, as well as a distinguished graduate of Yale Law School, for your reflections from your front row seat into this important discussion today. As you watch this discussion, please hit the like, subscribe, and ring the bell to be alerted to our fresh content. It really helps our foundation, and we appreciate it. Our panelists are remarkable, and I'm so appreciative that we were able to assemble the 2 of them today. Dr. Sarandis Randy Papadopoulos is a naval historian and subject matter expert on the studies of Pearl Harbor in World War II. Dr. David Rosenberg, a board member, no stranger to this audience, is a research staff member in the Intelligence Analyses Division of the Institute for Defense Analysis. He's a retired Navy captain and intelligence officer, as well as noted scholar. Welcome, gentlemen. Reflecting on the colloquium of our foundation that we sponsored 20 years ago this week, and on the remarks of Mr. Honigman, are there, to either of your knowledge, any new revelations other than a succession of U.S. presidents, beginning with President Clinton, failing to respond to the recommendation to restore Rear Admiral Kimmel and Major General Short to their highest wartime rank. Thoughts, gentlemen, beginning with you, Dr. Papadopoulos.
Thank you very much, Admiral Husband. No, I think that there's a lot of discussion about this, but I wouldn't describe these as particular revelations. I think that the state of play with regard to restoration of rank for Admiral Kimmel and Lieutenant General Short really hasn't changed very much in the past 22 years. That said, there are, of course, a variety of tactical things and operational things that we've learned since then. The research has been very robust, I think, in terms of what we understand about the consequences of the battle. We can get into that as we go forward in time. But really speaking, there hasn't been any new thing that is going to make us change our minds, particularly about how the Admiral and the General were treated after the attack and the Japanese defeat of the United States forces in Hawaii in 1941.
Great, thank you. Dr. Rosenberg.
I would agree with Randy on this. There have been a number of very valuable and very useful findings on the history, particularly the release of new information relating to the intelligence context, or even the discovery of new material that provide even a broader context to understanding why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and what might have happened, what changes were made, and so forth. The only thing that I do find rather fascinating is that no one ever revisited Kimmel and Short in the wake of 9/11, in the sense that that would in fact have been one of the times to in fact look at that as a time to ask questions about responsibility and relief of command and so forth. That did not occur, and so there's been no real concern. The other part of the problem, sadly, is the loss of World War II veterans, of Pearl Harbor veterans, and all, which means that this is truly receding into history rather than something that can be maintained as a current point of argument.
Yeah, that's a great point. We've got a great audience today, very senior audience. We've got former secretaries of the Navy, former 4-stars, plural. We've got folks that have a real sense of the adjudications of what constitutes appropriate accountability. And we also have an audience that, from their questions, these gloves are off, the boxing gloves are off, and people want to know where we stand as a panel on that, on, do we believe in restoration of this former rank, or do we not believe in it? And we can come back to that. But I just wanted to provide that context, but also to the audience to say thank you for your spirit. And we're going to get to everything that you want to ask. But as a part of this distinguished audience, there are many questions that are aligned to Dave Rosenberg and Randy Papadopoulos' academic and research backgrounds. And we'll bundle some of these questions in a minute. But I want to ask and allow the first question from the audience to come from Dr. Leonard Cavney. Dr. Cavney has been a contributor from our audience before. And as I mentioned at that time, he was a 10-year-old boy living in Makalapa housing during the attack. His father was a Year Group 1929 officer. And their next door neighbor in housing was Lieutenant Commander Dudley Mush Morton, whose picture is off the right shoulder of Dave Rosenberg in my office, and one of my personal heroes of World War II, who was the commanding officer of the Wahoo. Dr. Cavney's questions and comments are as follows. He hopes we work into the program, and I'll come back to the panelists on this, Rear Admiral Harry E. Yarnell's February 1932 simulation of how Japan could attack Pearl Harbor using aircraft carriers. And this is in both your swim lanes, particularly Dave Rosenberg's in the intel sense. The attack was not a surprise. And he has the front page of the 6th December 1941 Honolulu Star Bulletin with the lead article and photo, "Sudden order calls troops to positions, state of readiness is completed." And the word surprised, in his mind, must be removed from the chronicle. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to bring it over to the both of you to reflect on his personal observation. And of course, he's got an equity stake in this because he was there. We'll start with Dave Rosenberg.
The knowledge that Yarnell in fact staged the surprise attack was something that was known to the Navy. Yarnell went on to Fort Stars, commanded the Asiatic Fleet, and I think they certainly finished his story. May well still have been on some form, if I remember correctly, was still on some form of active duty into World War II on various boards and so forth. He was a serious presence and reminder of all of this. But the attack on attacking Pearl Harbor was not something that was actually new to Yarnell, although he did it. It was a case that what happened was that Billy Mitchell had talked about attacking the Hawaiian Islands on a Sunday morning in some of his writings. So it was known and often been pointed to. In addition, Joseph Mason Reeves, who in fact had pioneered as a captain, then moving on up until he commanded the battle fleet and the U.S. fleet, in fact had been somebody espousing and using naval aviation, pioneering in its use. And the excellent book by Tom Rosenberg on all the factors of victory provide all sorts of interesting insights on all of that. Now, the question is, to what extent did the Japanese study what Yarnell had done versus some of the things that Reeves was espousing in terms of whatever they saw in the U.S. fleet exercises during the time. This becomes one of those really interesting questions as to whether or not the Japanese took any of that into account. And it ties in with some of the same things that have been generally discredited. We don't know about Yarnell. We don't know about Reeves. But we do know that the Japanese at least would argue that they did not follow the pattern of the attack on Toronto by the Royal Navy, which sank a number of battleships in the fall of 1940. So that's the interesting. It's a good question. And certainly the only thing I would add would be this. It's very clear from additional things that have been stated by Minoru Genda, or were stated by Minoru Genda, that he paid attention to U.S. carrier exercises. So in that sense, for Dr. Kaplan, it's pretty clear that if he paid attention to carrier exercises, he knew about and undoubtedly studied whatever was available from Yarnell's attack.
And if I could follow up on that.
Yeah, please do.
I think it actually bears a little bit more specifically on Dr. Kaplan's question. Certainly, it's within the strategic realm of possibility there could be an attack on Pearl Harbor on a Sunday morning, as Yarnell's 1932 exercise postulated. But if that's the case, what sort of influence would it have had on, for example, Lieutenant General Short? Lieutenant General Short has got more aircraft than any of the commanders in Hawaii have ever had before. He's got more aircraft than Douglas MacArthur does in the Philippines. And yet, he's got only one of his 3 pursuit groups on alert that morning, and it's on 4-hour alert. That means that to be effective, his fighters to intercept the striking force at the Kido Butai on Pearl Harbor would have had to have known about the launch of the Japanese aircraft before they'd actually taken off from the aircraft carriers to be able to respond effectively. Certainly, there might have been 1 or 2 up if the very famous stories about the radar intercept station picking up the strike as it was inbound. But the fact is, General Short didn't make the choice to put his aircraft on a higher level of alert. That suggests that he wasn't expecting something on a Sunday morning, at least not on that Sunday morning.
Absolutely, and I think that's pretty clear too. I do have a question about Ned Beach, and back in the day when I was personally like a lieutenant commander, whatever, when Ned Beach produced something, I just, I couldn't wait to read it. It didn't matter what it was. And he wrote the book Scapegoats, and I want to say it came out when I was a commander, but I pre-ordered it from the Institute, received it, read it cover to cover, in about 2 days. And of course, he delves into this issue pretty substantially. And his conclusion, which a number of our audience participants today push on me, is that, hey, Ned Beach's conclusion is correct. But yet there's a little cynical side to that. And I'd like you guys both to comment on your view of Scapegoats. Was it a relevant work? Did it reflect, the appropriate view? And what might his motivation have been in writing that? I'll start with you, Randy.
Sure. It was my privilege actually to be at the Naval Historical Foundation with Captain Beach in the speaking that day. He was part of the debate that we held that morning, and I think that he overstates his case. He clearly emphasized that he saw this restitution of rank as a matter of honor. That's how he portrayed it at the time. Honor is an important concept to any military organization. I accept that in full. The fact is, however, did the two officers involved make mistakes in advance of the Japanese attack? And the answer, unfortunately, is yes. Does that mean that they're thoroughly responsible for everything, which is what the term scapegoat seems to imply? I would say no. There is shared responsibility. But the fact is, was the Secretary of the Navy or the President of the United States or the Chief of Naval Operations, for that matter, were any of them going to tell Admiral Kimmel where to put his ships or what condition to set his ships on a Sunday morning in Pearl Harbor to be? And the answer is no. So in that sense, while they may have had most responsibility, they were not scapegoats.
I generally I agree with Randy. I also was a commentator at the symposium that Randy gave the prime paper, and one of the things I noted is in terms of comments from Admiral Rosenberg was the fact that we had talked about this a little bit, and one of the things that he noted that related to some of the things I was trying to do about him in the Bay of Pigs was he said, "Don't make me a hero. It was a national disaster. Pearl Harbor is a national disaster." And so to, in fact, pick out Kimmel in short as being responsible can be seen as a form of scapegoating in one sense. But this is something that occurred to me that I mentioned to Randy, and he may want to comment further on this. And that is that there is the issue of restoring them to rank, their prior rank, is one issue in light of what went on. And I, at that time, was agnostic. I was sitting next to Admiral Max Showers, member of Station Hypo, good friend and mentor as a naval intelligence officer, and all. And we talked about this, but even he was unsure. But he was a good friend of Eddie Layton, who'd been the intelligence officer, who supported Kimmel. And so in that sense, the failure of intelligence is very important. But there's the other question that's out there, and that is, should Kimmel and Short have been relieved of command? And I would shoot back at members of the audience this question: if you left them in command, what would that have said to their forces, to the men under them, mostly men in this time frame, and what would that in turn have meant in terms of having that happen? Not to mention, if you will, the potential, at least mental PTSD that would come from being in command of a devastated force that you had been responsible for. And within that context, if you believe they should have been relieved of command, what should be the ultimate disposition?
To take a further point of that and get a little more specific, when visitors come to Hawaii in the immediate aftermath of the attack, Admiral Kimmel is quite blunt. He says, "They surprised us." He writes to the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Stark, and he writes as a nickname, "Dear Betty, they caught us." So he admits that he'd been surprised. Now, if one puts oneself in Admiral Stark's shoes as Chief of Naval Operations for just a moment, if you have a subordinate who says, "I made a mistake," do you then keep that subordinate in charge? He's admitting it at the time. And sure enough, only several days later, Kimmel and Short are relieved. That suggests that at the time, you really can't see them in this context as being, punished by this relief. It would be punishing their forces in some ways to keep them in charge. Do you want to keep working for somebody who has just lost a battle? And that's, I think, something that's amplified, something that Dave Rosenberg mentioned a moment ago. You have to make sure that the forces who have proven their resilience in some incredibly brave ways at that moment, at that time, do you want to reward them by saying you're going to keep working for the same people? And the answer in many organizations, and I suspect in the United States Navy of that day, the answer, and in the U.S. Army as well, the answer is no. You're going to find somebody who can do a better job. And that's what we should see when we talk about their reliefs as from their responsibilities after the attack.
I would also want to add one additional point. Since the phrase scapegoats implies that somebody is doing that, and that is the issue of FDR. FDR often gets accused, and was accused going way back, Harry Elmer Barnes, historian Beard and all, that somehow he was responsible for this. That somehow, as Robert Buteau wrote in an article in the early 2000s, FDR declared war on Japan at Pearl Harbor by somehow inviting the attack. None of this was true, but yet this is the other part of the issue that comes out about the scapegoating, is the issue they were scapegoated because, in fact, ultimately Roosevelt was responsible in one sense, which of course the president was, but at the same time that somehow he knew, and this was a way to get out from under any kind of political controversy, which is not the case. Although even at this session 20 years ago, 2 decades ago, Vice Admiral David was actually arguing that there were things going on the night before at an alleged meeting that was still trying to find out whether it ever took place, where they were talking about the issue in the Pacific. So there's a lot here, and in many ways, some of these things cannot be determined by history or historians because the data is just not there.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question that's really more a reflection just from my own view and ask you to comment on it. But in that period of time at the United States Naval Academy from 1904 to 1907, those classes, I think is very revealing, because at no time was I ever aware, and maybe you were, that some of his classmates, for example, Paul Stilwell just has a book out now on Willis Ching Lee, classmate, David Worth Bagley, classmate, William Frederick Halsey, classmate. And if you dip down even a single year, you're looking at Admiral Tom Church. You might have heard of Chester Nimitz, and others that Ken Whiting, who was still alive at this time, not for long. But the simple point simply that there wasn't they didn't turn their backs on him. They didn't bring up well, if it wasn't for this or wasn't for that. And it was almost like a compassionate handling and a respect, in a manner of speaking, but by the grace of God, kind of thing. That was kind of my observation, because in no place did I read in Stilwell's great book or other books, Halsey's bio, that there was anything really pejoratively, committed. And frankly, Halsey didn't even do that with Gormley and Guadalcanal. Any thoughts on that reflection by me?
There's a rich history, I think, of these personalities, and I'm glad that you brought up the biography of Willis Lee and the recent biography of Admiral Halsey as well. These are relatively humble people who I think that it's fair to say none of them really thought they deserved to be admirals. They saw it as a privilege to be in command. By the way, recall too, when we talk about permanent rank, it was perfectly appropriate for somebody to serve as Commander-in-Chief in Hawaii of the fleet, and then move on to another Navy Department job that was their permanent rank, which was a two-star rank. That's something that they all saw as what was the normal career path for an officer at that time. So, to their perspective, the fact that they wouldn't call out Kimmel and say, "You blew it," that's not something that to me is exceptional. I don't think that they're being exceptionally sympathetic. They're simply saying, "You had a bad day, to be sure." That may not mean that they wouldn't rub in his face. It means that it wouldn't rub in his face. On the other hand, does that mean that they come out and they start swinging to reinstate him to his full rank after the war is over? And the answer, unfortunately for Kimmel and for Short, is no. Let's remember too, the review panel, the first panel that actually goes out, the Roberts Commission that we heard about a moment ago, that two of the panelists on that commission are Admirals Stanley and Reeves. You've already heard about Reeves mentioned today. Those admirals are holding up Kimmel to the same standard that they believed applied across admirals in the U.S. Navy. There are two Army generals as well as one involved. They're major generals, as befits the fact that Short is the subordinate in this case. But that means that they're looking at professional standards and applying them across the force. And they're saying, well, this is clearly an error in judgment on the officers in charge, that has to be placed at the officers in charge feet. That's something that they are saying. They're not saying that they should be punished. They're simply saying relief, retirement, appropriate. And they're saying that they made the crucial mistake that they make is they don't talk to each other. I think that they, so in effect, they have an effect, and they also show the cause for that effect in that report.
I agree with Randy on this completely. And the key point is exactly this, that Kimmel and Short were relieved of command and hence returned to their 2-star ranks. And the question was, what situation would then compel their being reinstated at any point? They did nothing after Pearl Harbor. They did not remain in the service, and all. So it became, in effect, a political issue related to this perception of scapegoating. And that's not really necessarily what should be dealt with in terms of literally dealing with military accountability and all. And I just want to, again, re-emphasize one of the things that was also noted 2 decades ago. We had my good friend Captain Larry Sequist, former skipper of the Battleship Iowa, on the panel, who stressed accountability, of being in command. Admiral Burke, in a conversation I had with him about an officer I knew who when he stepped off the bridge of his destroyer at the Otek range, the ship went around, took off the sonar dome and the screws, and the fact was he stepped off the bridge to go to the head. His JO, who was the OOD, had turned the wrong way, and they relieved him of command. Was that wrong? No, because as Burke noted, he didn't do it. He didn't do it that way, but the officer under his command had been trained by him and so forth, and he, in the end, was responsible. So this is the question of how we regard this historically. Do we put it in a context of a political scapegoating, or do we put it in the context of accountability of command? And the key point to me, as a retired captain who's had command, no, not of a ship, but certainly of enough naval reservists in the intelligence business who could in fact cause all sorts of problems, that the key point on a lot of this is the idea that it is literally accountability for your people, and that's why this situation still should hold.
Thank you. The questions are just flying in. The energy of this is amazing, and I give that credit to you two. Jörg Schimmelpfennig, who's a member of our foundation, a historian himself, writes, and he's a great participant. We love him, and his spouse as well. But he writes in and he asks, and I'm going to take a crack at an answer myself, which feel free to tell me you disagree. But he says, whether or not laying the blame at Kimmel's feet was justified, would we agree that it deflected attention from the failings of Navy leadership as a whole? And I'm going to go with no myself, just simply because we were too busy in the aftermath responding to be worrying about it was really what we do. You know, what does our Navy do in response? We saw a great example of this on 9/11 with Admiral Natter, with Admiral Fallon, with Admiral Clark. And the question, what did our Navy do? We didn't reflect on, this plane came in and how did we not see it or any of that kind of thing. We were too busy doing the work of our Navy and nation, to do that. Back to you guys to address George's thought.
And that's a very important point, and I think it's worth mentioning. What is the Japanese objective in sinking 1, 2, 3, 4 battleships? If they could have gotten 1 or 2 carriers, they'd been happier still. The idea is inflict a massive enough defeat on the United States that the United States people and the United States military say, we can't do this, we give up. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. The point was, in fact, if anything, the military personnel who are doing their best to try to A, rescue comrades trapped on the capsized Oklahoma, for example, or B, fighting fires ashore, or C, are launching their aircraft into the air. What does William Halsey say when he takes his carrier Enterprise back into Pearl Harbor later that day? He said, we got to go back out. Let's go try and find them. And in fact, it's not the defeat the Japanese were hoping for. It is a military defeat, to be sure. Tremendous loss of life, destruction of equipment, ruining of people's lives in many ways. That's not, however, what the Japanese were trying to do in this case. The Imperial Japanese Navy is trying to win the war, basically, with one really sharp blow, or at least buy themselves a lot of time. In the end, of course, they don't get either one. And the fleet goes out and keeps fighting, resists as much as it can. I think that, in fact, in this case, I think that there's very little chance that we can say that anything else would have been the result.
And just following on to that, I concur with you, Sonny, as well as with what Randy just said. But the other point is, it's the question of what ultimately happened to those who in fact were in command. Well, the first thing was that not only was Kimmel relieved by Chester Nimitz as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, FDR appointed Ernest J. King as Commander-in-Chief United States Fleet, so that they divided what had been a combined command in which all the seagoing forces were under one officer. And King, while he had an office in the old Navy Department, also had a yacht that he lived on in the Navy Yard, and that was essentially his flagship and his headquarters. But then later in March, FDR makes the decision to relieve Betty Stark as CNO, despite his close relationship with Stark, going back to when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and sends him to essentially be Commander of Naval Forces in Europe, of which there weren't a lot at that time. And he stays there for the rest of the war, and he then combines the so-called Comments job, previously the acronym SINCUS, which was discarded, and with CNO, and gives that to Ernest J. King, who then has just remarkable power and is able to stay there through the rest of the war. And so there are consequences that you see. William S. Pye, who is commander of the battle force, is the acting commander. He ends up going to the Naval War College and is there for most of the rest, if not all, of the war. So most of the people who are out at Pearl Harbor at the time are, in fact, move on to different jobs. So this is something that occurred not immediately, but that gets to the question: if you're going to relieve Kimmel and Short, if you're going to deal with this, when do you do it? Do you wait after a quarter of inquiry, or do you realize this is really bad? And the other point being that, as Randy said, when the commander of the fleet tells the CNO, "I screwed up, I was caught, badly," you realize that's a psychological situation that you need to deal with immediately, and it's not necessarily something you're going to do immediately with FDR, although it does appear that FDR certainly chooses Chester Nimitz.
Yeah, thank you. I've got a couple questions, and by the way, we're not going anywhere, audience. You're growing, and your questions are coming fast and furious. Do not, we're going to get to everything we can. But there are two kind of related questions, and it really goes to Admiral James Richardson. And many in our audience may not know who he is, but he was fundamentally the predecessor to Admiral Husband E. Kimmel. And so there were two questions, one from a Dr. Manley Marshall. Thank you for your question. And then from one of our own family at the foundation, Commander Sean Walsh. And let me bring them both up. The failures that led to the Pearl Harbor disaster were too numerous to be laid on the shoulders of one man. More of a comment than a question. But how did that happen? And did President Roosevelt ever acknowledge responsibility for leaving the fleet concentrated in Pearl Harbor against the advice of Admiral Richardson? And then the second question from Sean Walsh is related. Admiral Kimmel replaced Richardson, who complained about the exposed position of the fleet. Did this factor into the hearings in terms of some compassion for the plight of the leader? Thoughts, gentlemen?
Well, first point is, when we talk about what the Pacific Fleet is doing, what the fleet is doing at that time, yes, a lot of it is concentrated in Hawaii. But the fact is, on that morning, the two aircraft carriers are out doing something else. They're reinforcing more exposed American garrisons farther west of the Pacific at Wake Island and at Guam. Johnson Island and Guam, I apologize. And also, there are large numbers of forces out on exercises. So about a quarter of the fleet not the battleships. A quarter of the fleet, including the 2 carriers that are in the Central Pacific, is away from Hawaii. So the concentration, which is, by the way, not a choice made by Franklin Roosevelt, it's a choice made by Kimmel, that concentration and that dispersion, rather, of the fleet is something that has to be taken into account. Now, Admiral Richardson's very famous firing early in 1941 is concerned about the fact that the fleet is too exposed. He's getting up against one of the most difficult problems in what we call civil-military relations. He works for a politician, Franklin Roosevelt. What does Franklin Roosevelt, as President of the United States, want to do? He wants to deter Japan. That's why the fleet's there. If the fleet gets withdrawn from Honolulu back to the U.S. West Coast, for example, it is certainly safer. But you're essentially telling the Imperial Japanese Navy, go to it. In other words, your deterrent effect of that fleet is gone. This is an unfortunate thing that military commanders have to execute sometimes. 2 days later, the Royal Navy also has dispatched a deterrent force to Singapore, which is sunk at sea with heavier loss of life, not including the Arizona, heavier loss of life. Prince of Wales and the Repulse are sunk off of what was then Malaya, now Malaysia, by Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft, land-based aircraft. That says that, in effect, deterrence didn't work. It doesn't mean that the deterrent wasn't worth trying in the views of the political leaders involved. Is that a mistake on the political leadership's part? Of course. But the fact is, should they have simply said, Japan, go to it? And the answer, I think, has to be no.
And I think it's worth it to actually look back at the question of deterrence during this period and understand that it was, in many ways, in its infancy, especially in the beginning era of air power. And it's not just the issue with the U.S. fleet. There was a Hawaiian detachment that was established after Fleet Problem 21 in 1940, and then the fleet was moved the following year against Richardson's recommendations, because Pearl Harbor was inadequate to support the fleet. It was not solely the idea that it might be vulnerable to attack. The fact was that Pearl Harbor was still undeveloped. So that's one key part. But nevertheless, the question was how to deter Japan, that now is moving. Remember, the war is no longer going on solely in China. The fall of France allowed Japan to move south, to move out of a stalemate and to take French Indochina and to contemplate what they would later do, move on Malaya, move on Singapore, and then move on the Dutch East Indies, where there are resources beyond imagination that can support a Japanese war. And so the fact of the matter is, this is all changing the nature of where things are. What's out there that the Americans have to worry about? The Philippines. It's a colony. We've promised it independence in 1946. But the fact of the matter is that this is something that we have to defend. Many of you have seen the movie Tora, Tora, Tora. It's not particularly well done in the movie Pearl Harbor, but you may recall it's a flight of B-17s that then are mistaken by the folks at Upon a Point radar as being, they're told it's the B-17s coming in from the mainland. Well, what are they doing? Are they reinforcing essentially Kimmel's Air Force? No. They're going on to the Philippines. It had been decided at the level of the president with George Marshall and Hap Arnold that those B-17s were going to Clark Field to be capable of attacking Japanese air bases on Formosa, Taiwan. The fact is, this was one of the first uses of air power, certainly strategic air power, as we know it, as a deterrent. And so the fact is, you're trying out a whole bunch of things right now, of which the movement of the fleet forward to Pearl Harbor is part of it. Now, that having been said, Joe Richardson was not wrong. The arguments he made are really important, and I and a number of naval officer friends of mine have always recommended his book on the treadmill to Pearl Harbor as something that they really, really needed to read to understand the problem of unpreparedness, both in terms of the material preparedness that an officer and a leader should have, as well as what your mindset should be. It is a great lesson, and particularly those of us who've been worrying about the People's Republic of China, that include my friend Jerry Roccolato and others, we're always, and my friend Dale Rela, who used to be the N2 at Pacific Fleet, we always recommend that book to people to look at to understand how do you understand what is in fact going on. Richardson was right, but FDR was not wrong.
Yeah, I see your context. I do. I'm embarrassed to admit that I have not read this book by Fred Borch and Daniel Martinez called The Admiral Advantage, United States Operational Intelligence in World War II and the Cold War.
No,
That's his book.
no, that's mine.
Oh, that's your book. Oh, Kimmel Short and Pearl Harbor.
Yes.
Kimmel
I
Short
guess,
and
yeah.
Pearl Harbor. There.
The Kimmel Short and Pearl Harbor. I'm embarrassed I have not read that book. But to that end, there's two questions that align with that. And Dr. Bill Dudley, former director of the Naval History and Heritage Command, and Mr. Jeffrey Beaumont, who's a friend of our foundation and was one of our second Saturday features in his great presentation of his father's artwork, Commander Arthur Beaumont. But the questions are, did any of the ships in the Kido Butai break radio silence during its passage through the North Pacific? And did the Navy intercept those signals to track the course of enemy's fleet? And then the second part is it accurate or not that code breakers actually broke the Japanese naval codes before the attack? Over to y'all.
All right, as an intelligence officer who benefited from the mentoring from a series of World War II veterans and directors of naval intelligence, the answer to both of those is no. I highly recommend an article, which you can't read the title from here, but go to the Naval War College website, go to the Naval War College Review website, and type in "Catching the Fox on the Wing." This is a superb study that was done in 2008 by Robert Hanyok, who was a retired National Security Agency historian and practitioner at NSA. And the fact is, this is the one that talks about Japanese radio denial and deception and the attack on Pearl Harbor. This is the one that finally clears up in one package what had been studied by people all along. There are journals, but they're fairly obscure and you have to pay to get into it, like Cryptologia, where there's a load of excellent, or Intelligence and National Security, where there are loads of wonderful articles that talk about all of this. But the fact is that you don't necessarily get this, and instead you're dealing with various conspiracy theories and various books that were playing up all of this. JN-25B was not being read by the British. It was not being hidden from anybody. Nobody saw. Marty Bollinger, who was a member of our board and a vice president, wrote a wonderful article about the Russians encounter the Kido Butai in the North Pacific in a ship. No, that didn't occur. You can go look it up. By the way, Wikipedia has an entire website of something like 20 some odd pages devoted to conspiracy theories in Pearl Harbor, so you could get your fill of all of it. But the fact is, the Kido Butai did not transmit. In fact, they went out of their way to, in fact, engage in radio deception, to make it appear as though they were off Kyushu, off of Sasebo, communicating to oilers and so forth. And Leighton is picking that up, and that's what he's saying. But then he loses track, because by that time, later, everything goes silent. The other point that's really worth noting is this, and Randy will talk more about this, given that he and I both studied this, and that is, the interesting thing is, we also deceived ourselves. And what I mean by that is, in late October, something shows up in radio traffic, because we could read the addresses, about the First Air Fleet. And the problem was, nobody knew what the First Air Fleet was. Well, the First Air Fleet was the Kido Butai, and it was different than anything that we had seen, which Randy will now talk about.
Yeah. And what you see at Pearl Harbor, and this is something that is startling, startling, deadly too. The Japanese put together 6 aircraft carriers. There are only 3 navies on the planet at that time that have 6 aircraft carriers. That of the Royal Navy in Britain, the United States Navy, and the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Japanese put every big carrier they had in one place. Nobody's ever put 6 together. The biggest that there's ever been a U.S. Navy exercise with is 4. Nobody will ever again put 6 aircraft carriers together until Tarawa in November 1943. This First Air Fleet, as Dave was mentioning a moment ago, That's it. Nobody expects a pulse of 340 airplanes in 2 waves to come and hit anywhere. And by the way, do we have a signal that says, and they're headed for Hawaii? No. They could be headed for, remember they've been lost, they could be headed for Midway Island, they could be headed for Wake Island, they could be headed for Guam, they could be headed for Manila. The Navy simply doesn't know. The fact that we had broken an earlier version of JN-25 earlier that year is very important, but that code has been changed and it's not being read anymore. It's not being used anymore, and the new one is not being read in real time. It becomes read subsequently. And this, by the way, ties in with something that is very hard for people to get to, because when does this get revealed? When does this become public knowledge? It's 1946, when you have a committee of 6 Democrats and 4 Republicans in the United States Congress sitting together and saying, oh, look, we could read Japanese codes. Well, yes, the diplomatic codes could be read. That's right. Yes, earlier naval codes could be read, but not the relevant code at the time that would have been needed to warn the fleet of Pearl Harbor, or to alert Franklin Roosevelt. So that in this case, there's really not a chance for anyone to get from the information, and the Japanese signals intelligence, rather radio security, is really very useful in this regard from their perspective. There's no warning. And to ask for perfect knowledge of what's inside the enemy commander's head is asking for too much. The question is, what do you do with the forces you have, and how do you prepare for what may happen? Admittedly, you may make mistakes, and not knowing where it's going to land. That all put together, this is really a remarkable thing, and we have to understand this. And by the way, if the fleet had gone out with the Enterprise, if the Enterprise had gotten back from delivering its 12 planes earlier, if they'd gotten the warning a day before, you're hunting for 6 Japanese aircraft carriers with 1 U.S. Navy aircraft carrier. You'd have lost it.
So, go ahead. I'm sorry, Dr.
I want
Dave.
to add one more part to this that's really important, because this is something that Matt Showers taught me, but it's also something that's very, very evident in the book that gets good credit at the very end of the movie, Midway, which does the best portrayal, actually, in its own very distinct portions of Eddie Layton by Patrick Wilson. It's a superb portrayal in the vignettes that it supplies. And the key thing is his book, And I Was There, was the book that, in fact, wrote the code on code breaking throughout the Second World War. And one of the things that Layton makes a very, very strong point about is the fact that he was not, nor was Kimmel, aware of the decryption of magic, the Japanese diplomatic code. And there were things that were going out over that diplomatic code that he would argue that if he had been put in on, would have, in fact, had an impact on what he advised Kimmel to do. And the key point on this in particular was the so-called message asking about the locations of warships in American ports, particularly Pearl Harbor. And the idea that when you're down to that tactical level of asking for that kind of information, it raises the questions of where the Japanese Navy might be thinking of attacking, and it then raises the questions of what additional precautions should we take. And this is one of the key points that, in fact, Layton makes. And it's a lesson about compartmentation that I wrote about in a review for the Naval Intelligence Quarterly, and was something that literally related to things that were going on in the Cold War. That, at least in the Cold War, some of the suppositions I had I was wrong about compartmentation. The guys who needed to know knew. But the key issue was that the more you compartmentalize, the more you hold things back, the harder it is, which is why you had various aspects of intelligence reform in the form of the Central Intelligence Agency because of the Pearl Harbor disaster, and why you had the Intelligence Reform Act after 9/11 as well. Now, whether it works, that's a totally different story. We're not going to get into it all.
Right now, I want to bring in that we talk, this topic of our homily today, our webinar is Pearl Harbor, the Kimmel controversy, but really it's revisiting the questions of accountability. And I think that Steve Honigman, the rock from which we build our church today, in a manner of speaking, is on accountability. And yes, there's a lot of historical perspective that you have brilliantly articulated, but to kind of just bring it back to the topic of accountability, you know, there's a lot of thoughts and questions on Beirut. You know, Colonel Tim Garrity, Lieutenant Colonel Larry Gerlach held accountable. The Cole, Kirk Lippold held accountable. It just goes down the line. Liberty, you know, Pueblo, we've talked about this. And there are other events as well, even in contemporary times, the Connecticut hitting an uncharted, you know, whatever, you know, it just goes on. And in the great and immortal words of Hyman Roth to Michael Corleone, you know, this is the business we've chosen. You know, I didn't ask who made, you know, it's one of those things. But I mean, the Rock of Gibraltar on everything we stand on and our core values of honor, courage, and commitment really goes to accountability. And I don't know how it's been more brilliantly articulated than by Stephen Honigman at the beginning of the show. But to that end, to bring it back to World War II and not get bogged down, you know, in these other events. Not that they're not important, but it goes back to two questions. One is, if the Indianapolis was zigzagging, and this is the Indianapolis comparison, as testified by the Japanese submarine commander, how could Kimmel be guilty of negligence? Okay, that's Douglas Watson, retired Navy captain, Auburn War Eagle. You let us down last week, Doug. But the other is Peter Borden, compare and contrast treatment of Kimmel and Short with the treatment of Captain McVeigh from the Indianapolis. And I think that really kind of takes it back to the same similar context of mindset. Gentlemen, over to you.
Well, to make an important distinction, I think that we have to talk about in the context of what Pearl Harbor is as a major American defeat at the opening of a war and sinking of the Indianapolis very much at the late part of the war. If there had been an open court-martial for Kimmel and for Short, what information would have to have been put out in open court to try them? Would you have started talking about signals intelligence? Would you have started talking about technology? Would you have started talking about alliance relations with the British? All at the time when you just suffered a major military defeat in the Central Pacific. That's why Kimmel and Short agreed not to be court-martialed at the time. They do ask for a court-martial once the war is over, but by that point, events have taken a whole different set of direction. Now, McVeigh has lost his ship, and could he have reasonably taken any precautions of zigzagging? He could have. In the light of that, though, by the time that Kimmel and Short are ready to have their court-martial and the circumstances permit it, it's not possible to, it's not propitious anymore. The issue has been blown way out of proportion in terms of American politics. It is an issue that everybody is certainly aware of. It's something that can be talked about on American streets then. It is indeed something that American citizens still have opinions about today, 80 years later. All of that suggests that a court-martial is simply not going to do what Kimmel and Short would have wanted to do, because it probably would have found them accountable. On that light, then, I think that the two situations of the Indianapolis and the commanders at Pearl Harbor, the two situations are on the surface similar, but they're not the same.
Let me also comment on the fact that the person who really pushed for the court-martial was Ernest J. King, and that King pushed it. The man who was president of the court was Vice Admiral Rosenberg, who hated it and didn't believe in it. And the other point about the McVeigh court-martial is that he's been exonerated, if I remember. And so that is justice being done. It was wrong for him to be tried in the first place. But let me point out one other thing about the issue of wartime contingencies and holding folk accountable. And that is that no one was relieved of command after the Battle of Savo Island, which was the worst, but arguably the worst defeat the United States Navy ever suffered at sea, period, on August 9, 1942. And the fact of the matter is, who was the officer in tactical command at that time was Vice Admiral V.A.C. Crutchley on board the Canberra, but also Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. And I just want to note that of all the people, Kelly Turner went on and there's a lovely two-volume biography that was done by Vice Admiral George Dyer, who supported him. Dyer, by the way, was a essentially a king's advisor on intelligence until he went back to sea. So there's some very, very interesting stuff that exists here about this story that still hasn't been told and which we may never find out. But in many ways, who was the guy who may well have been more responsible for Pearl Harbor in terms of making some decisions? Kelly Turner. One of the things that people forget, it's in Julius Führer's book on American naval administration, but it's a line that everybody misses. And that is, at the time of Pearl Harbor and through a good bit of World War II, the Office of Naval Intelligence was considered a post office in which information was in fact conveyed from the code breakers and others to the director of the War Plans Division, guess who, Kelly Turner, who will then advise the CNO as to whether anything is going on and as to whether anything ought to be done, because the intelligence was potentially too raw and he was the guy to interpret it. Well, Kelly Turner never has been held accountable for what he did or didn't say to Betty Stark or to Secretary Knox at the time of Pearl Harbor, not arguing that he is a conspirator or anything like that, but there's that point. The one thing we do have, however, are the two NSA histories by Frederick Parker about code breaking before Pearl Harbor and code breaking before Nimitz and before Midway, and it is very, very clear that Kelly Turner is bollocksing the works. And because he is, they're not sending the right messages, they're not giving the right information to Admiral King. And this is the other part, again, in expanding our understanding of what's going on. During this period, there had never been the idea that the intelligence officer worked directly for the Admiral. He was, in fact, getting other things, but he also supported the Office of Naval Intelligence and the Office of Naval Communications. What Joe Rochefort and Eddie Layton decided in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor is their job was to inform their commander directly what was going on. The difficulties that led to Rochefort's relief relate directly to that, as well as Joe's rather difficult personality. But the more important point of all of this is that what they said is, I'm going to help my commander, and the hell with, in fact, ensuring that this is what Washington is. I'm informing him, and Nimitz took that. And he took it from Layton, and he took it from Rochefort. And so as a naval intelligence officer at sea, working for two fleet commanders and the commander of the Pacific Fleet as well as commander of the submarine force, the thing that I knew was that my loyalty was to my immediate commander, operational commander. And that's what this was about. It didn't exist before Midway, and it took until 1943 to Ernest J. King to reorganize naval intelligence to reflect that. And so that's the other part of understanding how you came to grips with what actually Pearl Harbor represented, or even the history of the overall course of the war.
And I'm going to disagree with you on one very small point about Richmond Kelly Turner, because the historian Richard Frank has come up with a very interesting discovery, and we started off the discussion today with revelation. If you look at the list of aircraft destroyed at Pearl Harbor by the Imperial Japanese Navy, one of them is a B-24 bomber. Oh, why is there one B-24 bomber on the ground at Hickam Air Force Base that morning? And the answer is because Richmond Kelly Turner had ordered a reconnaissance mission to be flown on the morning of the 8th of December, 1941. Look for the Imperial Japanese Navy in the Marshall Islands, maybe get as far west as you can into the Pacific, and then fly back. Now, the bomber's destroyed on the ground. It doesn't have a chance to fly the mission. But it doesn't mean that, and I agree wholeheartedly about Kelly Turner bollocksing up things in the headquarters of the Navy at the time. But he is at least
but he's doing something.
He's doing something.
And I didn't know
about
that.
it.
It's a good point.
He's trying to. They're using the resources that they have at their disposal, and it's one plane for one long-range mission. It's much longer range than B-17 would have been, and it's configured for this. It's a very secret mission.
But it's an Army bomber. It's not a PD-4Y.
Exactly right. It's an Army bomber. Exactly so. So we are seeing some level of cooperation here and some efforts to do things, some steps towards reconnaissance. All of that suggests that if you're going to talk about accountability, who's in the position to make a decision on the spot?
Thank you, gentlemen. A couple points I'd like to make before we sort of begin the wrap-up process. The first one is when we really talk about accountability, there are numerous and substantial people in our history, both in government and in our Navy and military writ large, that talk about this. Norman Polmar wrote a book called Rickover, Controversy and Genius. And there's a lot that talks about, technical integrity and technical accountability and the rigor of, building a little, testing a little, and learning from that. I think we saw that in the successful Aegis program under the leadership of Wayne Meyer. When we talk about, is there new evidence on anything, this book on Indianapolis, it just came out, Lynn Vincent and Sarah Vladeck, and it's a very good read. It took me forever to get to it because of all of the other things that I read in support of our webinars, but amazing book, and I commend it to you. And then one of the newer ones, Paul Stilwell, Battleship Commander, about Willis Lee, Naval Academy class of 04, just a stellar individual and a real hero. So I encourage you to read, think, write, publish, and that. So before we move to the next phase, and we're getting close to the end, hang on one second, sir. I'll let you come to it in a second. Okay, back to you real quickly. Do we restore the pay grades or not? Dave Rosenberg and Randy Papadopoulos, how do you vote? The audience is about split over it. So, and then Dave, go ahead and whatever else you wanted to say.
Okay. Well, at the risk of having people, put things on my lawn, my answer is no. With due respect to the Kimmel descendants and all, the fact was, as we noted here, they were relieved of command, they were reduced in rank according to that to be restored for that. I just don't see the compelling need. The only other thing I wanted to add was that in looking at books on Pearl Harbor, there is this marvelous book by Alan Zinn, retired commander, called Attack on Pearl Harbor, Strategy, Combat, Myths, and Deceptions, that not only rewrites the history of the attack in many ways, it's an ops analyst approach to the problem, but he looks at the Japanese side of the problem of the attack. He looks at how Japan changed its naval strategy to attack, to attacking Pearl Harbor, rather than aiming to sink the fleet en route to the Marshall Islands, which, if that had happened, would have been much worse given the state of the U.S. Navy at the time. And as Randy and I talked about, imagine if Pearl Harbor had not been attacked, but Wake was attacked, and Kimmel, not having been attacked, decides to send the battle fleet to the battle force, the entire U.S. fleet, to relieve Wake, and is attacked by the Kido Butai at sea, and what might have occurred. Zim doesn't get into that, but it leads to those ways, to those thinking, and I strongly recommend people look at it. He also has a marvelous piece in the current naval history about the Japanese second wave and the failures that are tied to what's in this wonderful book.
Yeah, and Peter Kenyon brings up a book that I did read. It's Rear Admiral Robert Theobald's 1954 book entitled The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor, the Washington Contribution to the Japanese Attack. It brings some insights. Back to you, Randy. Yes or no? Do we restore the stars, or we do not restore the stars?
I take Dave Rosenberg's. I issued the same caveats that Dave did to the families of the Kimmels of the short. No, there simply is no way that we're going to do this at this stage. I don't think that it would be seen as a restorative gift in some ways. And I think that that's not something that we want to encourage. That sort of thinking to be encouraged. At some point in the future, I'll be judged right for a mistake that I made today. That's something that maybe we can leave to historians. We could arguably leave it to theologians on who is on the right side. But I don't think that we should be talking about it from the point of view of military promotions. It is a harsh responsibility. Let's face it. We ask people in uniform to make decisions that simply by doing the job may get people killed. Simply by doing the job. Do you want to start second guessing what the people who are their bosses say is an insufficient care in doing that job? I think that we have to be very, very careful in this sort of decision making. It's really very important to think about this. Kimmel had every intention of taking his fleet out to find and defeat the Japanese Navy at sea. He doesn't understand how the world has changed around him. He would have taken out his fleet and lost more of it, and it would have been more deadly. As it was, of the battleships sunk at Pearl Harbor, all but 2 come back. They would not have come back if they'd been sunk in 1,000 feet of water, 10 or 100 or 1,000 miles off of Honolulu. That's impossible. As it was, he made the wrong choices, as did General Short. And unfortunately, somebody had to be in charge at that time. They're the ones that happened to be there.
Thank you. I'd like to now shift back to our chief presenter and really his compelling, kind of construct of what is accountability, what is dereliction of duty, what is negligence. These were brilliantly articulated by him. And I want to come back to him because I want to hear his final reflections, but I also want to hear his sea story, my word, between he and Senator Strom Thurmond, and then what his final advice would be to SecNav and CNO on the matter. Stephen, over to you, sir.
Well, thank you, Sonny, and thank you to the panelists for a very, very interesting and thorough discussion. I had my own personal encounter about accountability with Senator Thurmond, and I just want to describe it. Shortly after we appeared before the senator and at his hearing, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Shalikashvili, retired. And my wife and I were invited to attend the ceremony of his retirement. And as we walked around the corner of the bleachers, who appeared right in front of us but Senator Strom Thurmond and his assistant, Duke Short. And Senator Thurmond walked up to me and he put his finger in my chest. And this is what he said: "We have to do the right thing for Admiral Kimmel. And I know that you the boy to do it." Luckily for me, John Deutsch decided that Ed Dorn was the boy to do it. And I think luckily for all of us, Mr. Dorn got it right. What struck me today is we talk about accountability, and we've been focusing on accountability upward. Admiral Kimmel's accountability to his seniors, but institutionally, accountability flows downward as well. And in my view, Admiral Kimmel and General Short were accountable primarily because they did not do what they were assigned to do, which was to cooperate and share information and be prepared. And if I can take just one moment, we've talked about radio silence and the Japanese carriers. Admiral Kimmel knew that the Japanese Navy had changed its code days before Pearl Harbor. Admiral Kimmel knew that the Japanese carriers had engaged in radio silence for 2 weeks. He also knew, days before Pearl Harbor, that the Japanese diplomatic codes had been destroyed, that an order had gone out to the embassies and the consulates, destroy your codes. He didn't tell that to General Short. And I think he deprived General Short of important information that might have led General Short to be more prepared for the eventuality of an attack at Pearl Harbor. So all in all, I think the panel's done a great job. All in all, my personal view is that Admiral Kimmel and General Short were relieved properly and that they should not be advanced to 4-star grade. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. The question of accountability is taught to midshipmen 4th class and continues to every career milestone in every warfare community. And I think our reflections, the brilliant reflections of our panelists and our introducer, Ward Carroll, really shows that there's much gray in a world that prefers the simplicity of black and white, but that's not the business we're in. I thank our panel of experts for the reflections, and I thank you for your participation today. You blew up the airwaves, and that just brings joy to my heart. As we look back over the day that will and has lived in infamy, 80 years seems both so long ago, but yet like yesterday. And thanks to the brilliant historians who continue to bring it as a principal focus, it is what we do in our foundation. You know, we look at our past to inform our future. The other thing that we solemnly do today is we remember all of those whose lives were lost on that day or affected tragically by the events of the day. Please join us next month for an enlisted-centric view of the Chief Petty Officer season, what happens in that process, how it's evolved. We've got a panel of experts coming that I think you'll be very pleased by, including some former Fleet Master Chiefs and a MCPON, Master Chief Petty Officer of the Navy. Please hit like and subscribe to our webinar and have a very happy holiday season, whatever your faith. We're right in the middle of the last days of Hanukkah. We've got the Advent season coming on for Christianity. We've got Kwanzaa. We've got it all. So anyway, stay close to your family. Good day, everyone. Thank you for a brilliant webinar.